Okay, welcome everybody on a new edition of the Church in Indian Country podcast. We have a focus here on Oklahoma, and especially on Catholic Native schools. So we have some very fine guests. So I'd like our guests to introduce themselves.
I'm Deacon Roy Callison. I'm the coordinator of the American Indian Catholic Outreach for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and I was part of the boarding school project.
Thank you, Deacon Roy. Michael, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Michael Scaperland. I've served as Chancellor for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City for the past 7 years. Most of my career, I was a law professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Law.
Very good. Okay, we're here to talk mostly about the Catholic Native School Project. Could you guys talk a little about what that is and what that entails?
Yeah, so as you know, the Department of Interior 4 years ago, was interested in looking at Indian boarding schools across the country. Our Archbishop Coakley and Bishop Wall from Gallup, New Mexico, asked all the bishops to cooperate in that effort. And in Oklahoma City, Archbishop Coakley tasked me and Deacon Roy and our now retired archivist George Ragazzi of imagining how we might go about learning about our Catholic boarding schools in Oklahoma. Bishop Condrela and Abbot Lawrence at St. Gregory's Abbey both agreed to join this project too, and it grew from there.
What is this, the project? What does it contain? What did you do in terms of this project?
Initially, my wife Susan thought, after hearing about the graves in Kamloops, that maybe we should go and listen to people at different parishes and get some of their feedback, people that had attended boarding schools or their ancestors had. So we started going to different parishes throughout really the entire state of Oklahoma and doing listening sessions, giving the people a chance to speak about their experience with the boarding schools or relatives that they might have had attended boarding schools. And then it kind of grew from there to the Oral History Project. And Michael, you know more about that than me.
So, yeah, and to give some context, there were 95 Indian boarding schools in Oklahoma, and 11 of them were operated by a Catholic entity or different Catholic entities. And so we were really looking at those 11. Occasionally, I think Deacon Roy came across folks that were Catholic that were attending a government-run boarding school too. But yeah, so out of the listening sessions grew kind of a desire to learn both about our archival history and then also to expand into an oral history project. George Ragazzi, the archivist at the time, had connections at Marquette where many of these archives were held. We met an associate professor, Brian Reinfleisch, who associate professor of history at Marquette, who received his PhD at Oklahoma. He was enthusiastic about this project and agreed to be the independent reporter. He produced a book that was published by Marquette Press last year, Negotiating Assimilation and Missionization in Indian Territory, which kind of gives a history of the archival and some anecdotal and oral history, but mostly archival history of Indian boarding schools in the United States, in Oklahoma. He also, and then out of that project, we also wanted to expand our oral history and attempted first to work with the University of Oklahoma to do that and have some people in either the history department or Native American Studies do that. For various reasons, that didn't pan out. So the Archdiocese, both dioceses and the Abbey ended up contracting with a PhD historian to try to capture oral histories of people as to get either their direct experience with in Catholic Indian boarding schools or the stories that have been handed down through the generations in their families.
Very good. Could you hold up the title of the book or the cover of the book to the camera so we can read it? And you could just tell me the title again? Yes, yours is much better.
Okay, you've got a better camera on yours. So the book is Negotiating Assimilation and Missionization in Indian Territory, Native Americans, the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions and Boarding Schools in Oklahoma, 1870s to 1960s, by Brian Rindfleisch, Rindfleisch, and it's published 2024 by Marquette University Press.
In your discussion there, you mentioned government schools and Catholic schools. Some people watching this might not know the difference because there's a vast difference in the two different types of schools. So could you just tell me the difference between government native boarding schools and Black and Mission Indian Office funded boarding schools, or those funded by the Catholic Church? Could you just tell me, either one of you, just tell me the difference between those two?
So the government had money to create Indian boarding schools throughout the United States, and some of those they did directly. There were government-run schools. Others they contracted with various religious groups. There were Methodist schools and I think Episcopal schools, other schools, Presbyterian schools, and then Catholic schools. So these were the Catholic Church partnering with the federal government to deliver these sorts of education.
Well, there's like Riverside Boarding School. It's a Bureau of Indian Education, so that'd be another government entity that supported a school, and it's still in operation now. And we have Sequoia Boarding School here in Tahlequah, but it's tribal run by the Cherokee Nation. And I think that, I'm not sure, you might have to correct me on this, Michael. I think there were some schools here in Oklahoma that were ran by individuals as opposed to government and religious schools.
There might have been, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my research, I found that although in the 1800s, some of the Catholic schools were funded by the federal government, those funds stopped in the early part of the last century. But some of the legacies still continue even after that. I would talk about in your research and your report here. One thing that crossed my desk on a very routine basis is the moral lapse of Catholic boarding schools. A lot of people talk to me about having great experience in a boarding school, but others talk about the historical trauma and what they've went through. And the Bishops' Subcommittee has grabbed onto that and have published that in our framework, Keeping Christ's Sacred Promises, which have an apology for the moral lapses. But did you come across any abuses in your research and your work with native boarding schools?
So there was a broad range of experiences, some very positive and some traumatic. One of the things, and Deacon Roy, you can add to this, but one of the things that struck out to me was that we had a couple of bishops whose attitude was, let's work with the Hispanics. At that time, probably a very small Mexican American population in Oklahoma. They're much easier to work with than Indians, and so there was at least one or two bishops that were sort of dismissive of Native Americans and their educational opportunities. So that was a moral lapse, and that probably, in some cases, like with St. Catherine Drexel schools, probably didn't have a great impact, but that attitude would have filtered down in some cases.
Yeah, and it really gets into that topic in that book by Brian Rindfleisch. He speaks about a couple of our bishops we had in Oklahoma felt it wasn't worth the effort, so to speak, to try to educate the American Indian people. So, and he mentioned about, and this was like in 1920s, I think it was, they were more focused on Hispanics, even though it was a low population, but there were a lot of factors involved there. But the book really gets into that topic.
Yeah, and as far as some of the moral lapses and abuses, I think part of it was just the time. I remember even in the 1970s having erasers thrown at me by teachers, thrown at my head. I know my uncle was a principal of a public school, and he engaged in corporal punishment. He had a paddle. So some of the things that we'd look at as abusive today were prevalent in Indian boarding schools, public schools across the spectrum. Others might be more specific to Indian boarding schools.
Yeah, some of the abuses went much further than just I'm from the era too where you got a paddling if you didn't behave, but some of the abuses went far beyond that at some of the schools. The schools that the parishes that my wife Susan and I went to, there were a lot of positive aspects to attending boarding school. Only one person we met had suffered a type of abuse. I wouldn't want to mention his name, but it didn't deter him from loving the church. So I'm still being very as active as he can in the church. So
One of the interesting finds was the amount of agency the Indian tribes and Indian parents had. In some cases, the tribes and the tribal leaders actually demanded that the schools be run by the Catholic Church and not by the government or some Protestant outfit, a Protestant denomination. In other cases, just like today, in parishes, parents who weren't happy with a particular priest or a particular sister said, we're going to pull our kid out of school if you don't replace this priest or this sister. And in some cases, they prevailed, and the sister or the priest was removed. So that was, to me, one of the surprising finds was the amount of agency both individual parents had and tribal leaders had.
yeah, some of the parents and the tribal leaders, if like Michael was saying about, say, a particular parish priest, uh, some of the tribes supplied a lot of the money to the schools, and they use that as leverage to have a little bit of control.
Yeah, in my reading of the book and also my other research, I found that in terms of control, the native leadership had actually a lot more control in Catholic schools than he did in government schools, mainly because the government schools are way off
Right.
in another state or something like that, and the Catholic schools, by and large, are located within the tribes themselves. So even the location allowed them to have better control. Now, as Deacon Roy said, a lot of these Catholic schools, because they were not funded by the government, they were funded a lot of them by tribes themselves, which gave them a lot more control over the schools.
Right.
Yeah, so both funding and I think you're absolutely right about location, because at that time many of these tribes were still fairly what's the word, non-sedentary. They moved around with their teepees, and they would set up camp sometimes right near the school, and those that were sedentary, often the school was right in their community. So there was much more back and forth and flow between the parents and the school.
And as
Yeah,
you said,
some of the families that set up, like you said, wanted to be near their children, and they wound up doing some actually working at the schools sometimes, which brought them even closer to their children.
yeah, as you said, also leverage was the ability for, although they had to send their kids to school, even boarding schools, they had flexibility to find which boarding school they could, especially later on in the 1900s. And so they could take their kids out of Catholic schools and put them into another school. So that, of course, gave them some leverage of some control over what was happening in Catholic schools.
Now, one thing about the listening sessions that Susan and I conducted was we got in on the tail end, so to speak, of the boarding school era, and I think it was Anadarko was the last one that was closed in the 1960s. So the people we interviewed, for majority, had a positive idea about the schools, how it affected their lives, and they got a great education. So in the book now it gets more into earlier times before when this, like we're talking about now, when there wasn't so much choice about where you lived, because we Indian people were forced to certain areas. So that affected it a lot too. But this book really gets in detail about that.
And part of the historical background, there's a Father William Ketchum was the first priest ordained for Oklahoma. He was the head of the Indian Black and Indian missions in D.C. for many years, and I've got a letter I've got an autographed picture of Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft on my wall, and a letter from Roosevelt to Taft introducing Father Ketchum. But Father Ketchum was a great friend of the Native Americans and really worked to try to advocate for their rights in D.C., including their boarding school experience.
Now, here's another book that's very it really gets into great detail about the boarding schools, Catholic boarding schools, and it does get into some Protestant also. But it was written by Father Francis Paul Pruchaw, and you know Chief Standing Bear, don't you, Michael, from Osage? He was
Yes.
he was one of his instructors.
Right.
So
Yeah. And I think Father Pruchaw was one of the early ones to write on this topic.
yes, yes.
Okay, you talked about both the good and the bad in terms of boarding schools, especially in Oklahoma. And I've worked with the American Catholic Indian Schools Network with trying to work with their work with reconciliation within their communities, especially about those who are suffering from trauma. And in my work with them, their focus is learning from the past in order to change the future. And they've done a lot of that. They do massive language programs, tribal language programs, but also enculturation within their schools at all the grades. So looking forward in the future, the report that you worked on lists some recommendations. Can you talk about the recommendations of what the Archdiocese or in the Diocese of Tulsa are working on, and how do you see that?
So the first thing we did when we received the copy of the published book, we sent 2 copies to every tribal leader in the state. There are 39, correct me if I'm wrong, Deacon, right? I think 39 recognized tribes in the state. Sent 2 copies to each of them, to each of the tribal leaders, and asked for their response. And so we still haven't gotten that, but I think that the first thing we wanted to do was listen to the tribe's reaction to the book, and to the study, so that we could get a sense of where they are in this, so that we could respond to that. And so we're still early in that. I don't think we've heard back from anybody yet.
You know what you mentioned about sending the books out. Well, I thought we would have response earlier than this, but you know, we Indians are kind of we make good Catholics. If everything goes slow, we don't get in any hurry.
So one of the, and I kind of say this jokingly, but it's also true. When the Department of Interior said they were going to study boarding schools, Indian boarding schools in the United States, there was I think it was a Methodist bishop in Oklahoma, but anyways, another denomination immediately apologized for all the bad stuff they had done in this boarding school project, in their boarding schools. And our response was, we have no idea I mean, that history was sort of lost, or you know, nobody in current memory really understood that history. So we wanted to study it so that we could celebrate the good and apologize for the bad on very specific levels. And I've already mentioned one area that needs apology, and that is that the 1 or 2 bishops' sort of dismissiveness of the attempts to educate Native Americans. And there'll be other things to apologize, but really, before we even get into that, I think we want to hear from the tribal leaders about how they respond to the project overall.
Yeah, I think you're right. When I first got this job, and the boarding schools what became a very big issue. A lot of Native leaders, Catholic Native leaders, say, Father Mike, we just don't need an apology. We need action steps. We need to work with us to move forward in terms of reconciliation and healing. And after you've done those action steps, I would take some furtive efforts within the Native Catholic community. Then after that, you can listen or work on an apology. But you don't apologize until you've shown us that you can deal with this issue in a very serious manner. And that's what we did with the pastoral framework. As you said, the most important part is listening, and we did a lot of listening sessions, so I know exactly their concerns to put in the pastoral framework. And then you mentioned the Bishop Wall, Archbishop Coakley letter, and that is the 4 action steps that we're working on nationally. And a lot of bishops and archbishops are working on very specifically in their own archdiocese on those four steps. And then, of course, we do have a very important, a very powerful apology in the pastoral framework.
You know, one one thing, Father, is Michael mentioned we sent 2 books out to each of the 39 tribal leaders. You have to remember in Oklahoma that most Native Americans are not Catholic. There were only like 11 Catholic schools the whole time, so that left 82 that were non-Catholic, whatever government ran or whatever. So I'm not sure how interested they are, just to be truthful with you, since they're not Catholic, and most of the schools were run by non-Catholic either denominations or government or tribal, or so that might be a little bit what's playing into the slow response. Not that they won't respond, hopefully they will. You know,
And I think we'll follow up in a month or two. We'll follow up more proactively and say, hey, have you had a chance to read it? Have you had a chance to talk about it amongst yourselves? We'd like to set up a meeting to visit. And as far as action steps, so Deacon Roy and his wife Susan are instrumental throughout the state. They work across the state, both dioceses.
Deacon Roy, what was the listening sessions about? And did you have other people rather than just Catholics, but also those from government boarding schools and also from non-Catholic boarding schools? And what was that dialogue about?
Well, the listening sessions were just what they say, listening sessions. We didn't have a dialogue with them. When we went into the parish, after we got permission from the priest, we let the people speak. We didn't ask them questions or anything. We just let them give their story. So, and there was one instance where some ladies from, well, 1 or 2 might have been Catholic, but they were fallen away Catholics, unfortunately. And they came in and spoke about the trauma that their ancestors had endured, but their ancestors weren't at a Catholic boarding school. I think it might have been Muskogee Creek, if I remember correctly. But yeah, there was really, like I said, there was no dialogue with the people. We didn't want to maybe influencing them into saying something, so we just listened and recorded it.
Are you continuing with the listening sessions, or is that project completed?
It's completed. We went to all the schools or all the parishes that had a boarding school near them or at the school itself, and we completed that prior to the oral histories project.
Excellent.
And the oral history project has been going much slower than we had hoped. The person who's conducting those or organizing those has put advertisements in tribal publications and other things to try to encourage people to come and give their oral history. And that's a much more guided project. It's not just listening, but questions and answers and all that. But I think the response has been far short of what we had hoped it would be. That's still ongoing with attempts to do that.
I wonder if some of the slowness is the fact that we had already interviewed the people or had the listening sessions, and they thought, well, I've already done this once.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
And getting non-Catholic Native Americans to come to something like that would be very hard to do.
I think also a problem is that it's very hard for people to talk about trauma, especially the trauma that they've gone through. So sometimes they have to come to grips with that before they can express it publicly. So that might be a concern too.
Yeah,
we had one gentleman that had been traumatized by at a boarding school and by a priest, but he was very open about it, but later he was a little bit hesitant, I think, when it came to the oral histories project, because it was so amazing. He had endured this, but he was afraid. He said he didn't want to do anything to damage the church because he loved the church. So, he wanted to be very cautious. He was very open with us, but when Brian Rindfleisch came, he was a little bit drawn back because maybe he thought, well, I wish I hadn't said this or said that, but he's still
and one of the things that Archbishop Coakley and Bishop Conroy very much want is transparency. I think Archbishop Coakley's view is one of the things that will hurt the church is lack of transparency.
Yeah.
So we want to encourage those stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, whatever they are, because we can't have healing unless we're honest.
Yeah, what I've learned throughout my job here and doing a lot of research on boarding schools. When I first arrived, I thought all boarding schools were the same, that they all suffered from the same amount of abuse, but that's not true. It seems that as what we've talked about before, is the Catholic schools actually did a lot better in terms of abuse. Of course, it was still there, but a lot more problems were with government boarding schools and other boarding schools rather than the Catholic boarding schools.
Yeah, well, it's a
Well,
lot of emotional abuse, I think, because being separated from your family, the kids being away from their family and the lifestyle that they were used to, that was pretty traumatic.
and even within Catholic boarding schools, I think it was even a different experience at different boarding schools at different times. And one of the context for this, and I think we sort of alluded to it earlier, or I think Deacon Roy did when he was talking about some of the Protestant denominations wanting to edge out Catholic education, is all of this arises at a time of great anti-Catholicism, the Blaine amendments that tried to diminish Catholic schools across the board, defund Catholic schools across the board, and no money going to the Catholic schools, and public schools being basically Protestant-run schools. So that's the whole context of that, and the great Catholic immigration at the time. And so I think one of the things that Professor Rindfleisch finds is that in some schools, some Catholic schools, although the government's program was to Americanize, assimilate the Native American, there were some priests and sisters that allowed, even though it wasn't supposed to be allowed them to speak their own language, at least in the dorms, to keep some of their culture. And again, that was inconsistent, but many of these priests and sisters weren't native English speakers either. So I think some of them had greater tolerance for the customs and the language of Native Americans.
And
Yeah.
some of the schools did have some Native American teachers. The Osage had some sisters that were Native American, and I think the Choctaw had a couple of sisters that were Native American. But talking about the different schools, this is a good read right here that really gets into about how the Protestant denominations, various Protestant denominations, tried to edge out Catholic schools funding.
I would just want to introduce Father David Bailey. Father David, we're just talking about a lot of things. One of the most important things we're talking about, the difference between government schools and Catholic schools. And there was a vast difference in terms of abuse, but also in terms of learning and enculturation. So it's been interesting in terms of this discussion. Do you have any questions, Father David?
No, I just glad to be able to join you guys. I'm actually sitting in my confessional, so if anybody has anything they need to get off their chest,
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned.
yeah, you, me, and everyone else. Yeah, it's interesting the point that you're talking about. I know that in the United States, the percentages of BIA-run boarding schools versus church-run boarding schools, and then of the church-run boarding schools, the percentage that were Catholic, I think that leaves us with something like, I don't know the percentages. I think it's something like 35-40% of boarding schools would have been run by the Catholic Church in the United States, but 60% in Canada were run by the Catholic Church. So yeah, interesting points to certainly to clarify for sure.
Anyway. Father Bailey, you were talking about the boarding schools in Canada. We heard a lot at those listening sessions in Phoenix about that, didn't we, Father Carson?
Yes, we did. And I'm also in contact with Tracy Blaine from Canada, who's my counterpart with the Canadian Conference, and we correspond rather frequently. We have a meeting every month talking about the difference between Canada and the United States and how we can learn from each other.
Well, so a question, since I was given the opportunity to ask one, is I guess this especially is for Roy and his wife, but also well, for everyone who's a part of this, Father Carson and everyone. In the interactions I've had as a Catholic priest with boarding school survivors or their descendants, the interactions range from very emotionally intense, but ultimately healing, and very rewarding in that regards, to situations in which you are dealing with people who have a lot of righteous indignation and anger. And then, of course, a lot of times the anger is not even really on the part of this person that survived the boarding schools themselves. It was one of their descendants, perhaps, who are perhaps the angriest. But then there's a lot of cases where I have been with people who were boarding school survivors, and there were tears and there were anger, and at the end of it, there were hugs, and there was a feeling of some healing being done there. I wonder your experiences, if you haven't already discussed this, about that. Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel that there is healing, that there are bridges being built, and there is things being mended between those who are negatively affected by the boarding school experience, and those of us in the church now who are trying to be a part of that healing process?
Well, with me, the only way I can judge that is our ministry. We still go to the powwows and set up and give away Catholic literature, rosaries, everything like that. And we're still received with welcome with open arms. So I don't know, and everyone's aware of the boarding school situation. I don't know if that's a gauge or not, but there has been a little slowdown. But I feel that like maybe they're having healing themselves, maybe without even going to someone. I don't know, that they just feel that this has been done and we have to get past this. I don't know, Father, but that's the only thing I can judge it by. We went to the listening session that Secretary then Deb Holland had in Anadarko, and it was in a gym just packed with people. And we heard some really traumatic stories. It was, I mean, everything from making the kids wash with lye to washing their mouth out with lye and things like that. But we heard some positive too. So,
And that wasn't specifically Catholic boarding schools. That was just any boarding school.
there were only 2 or 3 people there that spoke up as being going to Catholic boarding schools, and Riverside also there, you know. But it wasn't specifically, it was open to, there were people from Canada, everywhere that came to that. It was really something to be a part, to listen to.
It says a lot that that you're talking about the reception that you have at powwows. I mean, you know, I've known for all of my years with Native people that if Native people like you, they'll tease you,
Yes,
criticize you, and just rib you mercilessly. And if they don't like
they
you, they
said
won't
we don't
speak
have a sense of humor.
right. And if they don't like you, they won't speak to you at all. They won't say anything to you. So your reception at the powwows with people welcoming you, and that's a lot. That's a good barometer.
Yeah, they've asked me to do opening prayers for the powwow.
Yeah.
We've actually one instance they wanted to be sprinkled with holy water. You know, they wanted, Susan read out sacred scripture and sprinkled with holy water. And the lady that asked it of us for all the princesses, she goes, "Wow, did you hear that sizzling when that holy water hit?" So there's your joke.
Yeah, there's your joke. Yeah, let me say real quick though, before the others get to answer, I want to commend you and your wife both, because I know emotionally, when I'm in those kinds of environments, which isn't as often as it is for you, it's so draining sometimes. And yet you guys do this consistently. You must just have real thick skin, but just really big hearts. And I just want to, again, I know as we have already done before, commend you and your wife, and for all of you guys for doing this work. It says an awful lot about you, and it's very, very needed and appreciated for sure.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And I think Professor Reinfleisch understood that too. He spent a lot of time with Deacon Roy and Susan, but he opens his book in the introduction talking about the listening sessions that Deacon Roy and Susan Callison did. So I think he was very touched by your work as well.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Father David idea that your ministry, Roy, and your wife, in terms of listening sessions, as a very powerful ministry and a very important ministry, because I do hear back from people who've gone through that, who've gone through listening sessions, and they've been transformed in terms of a first step to healing and reconciliation, which becomes very, very important. I think that sets apart, especially in our Catholic Church, with Protestant churches and government churches, our government institutions, saying that we do have a path forward, and our path is Christ in terms of reconciliation, healing, and that Christ gives us what we need to do and then how to do it. And we follow that with this very, very important ministry. In fact, in the last Holland's report, Secretary Holland has commented upon that. He says, this is what the Catholic Church is doing. Why aren't we doing it? So that's very, very powerful too, that we are showing the way in terms of the work of healing and reconciliation.
You might remember this, Michael, when we first started the listening sessions, and Chief Ben Barnes of the Shawnee was one of the ones that we had a Zoom call with, and he commended the Catholic Church. He said, this is the only religious organization, as he called it. He's a fallen away Catholic that has actually reached out to us. And, he really commended the church about that.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, to seek out reconciliation and healing is kind of a mandate of our faith. We're doing it because Christ wants us to do it.
Yeah, and this is dated, so I'll have to edit it, part of it. But this weekend, our gospel passages this weekend: love each other, even those who hate you, even those who persecute you, even those who. That's fundamental to our beliefs as Catholics.
So just want to, any other closing remarks, anything else you want to say before we wrap this very important and very interesting discussion?
No, thank you for your work, and thank you for your interest in our work.
Good, yes, keep up the good work. Is going to be a follow-up to the book?
Well, I don't know about a book follow-up, but yeah, the follow-up will be reaching back out to the tribal leaders to do some listening with them on their reaction to the book. Okay,
I'd like to thank our guests here, and especially their great work with reconciliation, healing in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma and the Diocese of Tulsa. So continue that God may smile upon you and to help you out with your work. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.